32 years old and still unmarried. Cosette's voice carried across the glittering ballroom like a bell designed to wound. Crystal glasses trembled on silver trays as laughter rippled through the crowd surrounding the Greyborn family table. Honestly, Father should have sent Thessaly to a nunnery years ago. Soft, chuckling, spread among the guests while candlelight danced against diamond necklaces and polished marble floors. Thessaly kept her gaze lowered, pressing her fingertips against her lap beneath the tablecloth, where nobody could see them shaking. Then Marceline leaned forward with delight burning across her expression. "Oh, Thessaly, you simply must see what Lord Pemberton gifted me for our anniversary." The youngest sister lifted her wrist lazily beneath the chandelier light, revealing a bracelet dripping with rubies and white gold. Several women nearby gasped with admiration. He had it commissioned from a jeweler in Vienna. Though I suppose fine gifts from devoted husbands are rather foreign territory for you, dear sister. It is exquisite, Marceline. Delphia tilted her wine glass thoughtfully before adding her own strike. Do not lose heart entirely, Thessaly. Perhaps a kindly old vicar may still take pity on you someday. Laughter spread wider now. Lord Aldrich Greyborn sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone as he raised his glass toward the room. The Greyborn name has always commanded respect in English society. He paused deliberately, then allowed his gaze to drift toward Thessaly. Almost always the ballroom seemed to tighten around her. He climbed painfully up her neck as dozens of faces turned in her direction with expressions ranging from amusement to quiet pity. Thessaly gripped the edge of the table and slowly began pushing her chair backward. Then a voice cut through the silence from somewhere near the center of the room. A tall gentleman in a dark evening coat stood among a circle of admirers, gesturing carelessly with a crystal glass as someone whispered a question toward him. His answer carried clearly across the polished floor. Her? Nobody important. Duke Everard Blackthorne did not even glance in Thessaly's direction as he spoke. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of whispered agreement through the guests surrounding him. Thessaly felt the last thread of composure snap somewhere deep inside her chest. She stood from the table without a word, turning toward the nearest corridor, desperate for air, for darkness, for anywhere these voices could not follow. And then the grand doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, with a sound that silenced every voice in the room. A royal herald stepped forward, his staff striking the marble floor 3 times before his announcement thundered across the palace. Her Majesty Queen Margot. The entire ballroom dropped into silence so complete that the flickering of candle flames became audible. The Queen entered slowly, draped in ivory, silk, and pearls that shimmered beneath the golden light. Her eyes moved calmly across the frozen crowd. Then she stopped walking, and she spoke a single name that nobody in the room expected: Thessaly. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional dramas filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and redemption, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us begin. You are not alone. Thessaly Greyborn stood near the long serving table inside the West Dining Hall, arranging porcelain cups beside a steaming silver teapot, while laughter echoed from the drawing room behind her. The scent of braised lamb, buttered parsnips, rosemary bread, and mulled wine drifted through the crowded corridors as servants hurried between rooms carrying platters for yet another gathering hosted by her father. Nobody noticed the eldest daughter of the house standing among the china, or rather nobody cared to. Pardon me, could you fetch more cream for the tea? A visiting baroness gestured toward Thessaly without looking up from her conversation. The woman had no idea she was speaking to Lord Aldrich Greyborn's firstborn daughter rather than a member of the household staff. Thessaly smiled gently and fetched the cream without correcting her. Across the drawing room, Cosette reclined elegantly beside Lady Farnsworth, discussing the latest opera season in London with effortless authority. Delphia sat near the pianoforte examining a new pair of pearl earrings her husband had sent from Edinburgh. Marcelin held court near the fireplace, surrounded by 3 young women hanging on every word of a story involving a comte she had danced with during a recent trip to Paris. Their jewelry caught the firelight constantly. Their voices filled every room they entered. Thessaly listened from beside the wall, her plain gray dress making her nearly invisible against the dark wood paneling behind her. 5 years earlier, she would have been seated among them. 5 years earlier, gentlemen had requested introductions during every gathering her father hosted. Now, guests looked through her as though she had slowly dissolved into the wallpaper of the estate itself. Greybourne Hall stood among the finest aristocratic homes in the northern counties. Tall limestone walls rose above sculpted gardens that stretched toward a private lake surrounded by ancient oak trees. Inside, marble fireplaces dominated every reception room, while golden-framed portraits of 4 generations of Greybournes lined corridors so long that footsteps echoed before fading. Lord Aldrich maintained the family reputation with obsessive precision. Every dinner, every alliance, every marriage negotiation inside the manor served one purpose only: prestige. And Thessaly had become the family's most visible failure. At 32 years old, she remained unmarried, in a society that measured a woman's worth almost entirely by the ring on her finger. That single fact had slowly erased everything else about her. During Sunday church services, older women lowered their voices the moment Thessaly passed their pew. Younger girls studied her with quiet horror, as though she represented a terrifying prophecy of what awaited them if they failed to secure a match before their beauty faded. The cruelest observations always came from women who believed their whispers could not be heard. She had such promise once. Thessaly overheard a countess murmur after a charity luncheon the previous autumn. "Terrible waste. Beauty cannot outrun time forever," another woman replied softly. Thessaly continued walking as though the words had not reached her. She had learned years ago that reacting only made the pity sharper. That afternoon, while the guests continued drinking wine and exchanging gossip inside the drawing room, Thessaly slipped through the servants' corridor toward the kitchens, where the air always felt warmer and the company always felt kinder. Flour dusted the long wooden counters, freshly baked bread cooled on iron racks beside the windows, while 2 cooks stirred enormous pots of vegetable broth over open flames. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, warm butter, and rising dough. It was the only room inside Greybourne Hall that ever felt like home to Thessaly. Near the corner, a young boy named Arlo sat on an overturned crate, crying silently while pressing a damp rag against his swollen wrist. He had twisted it badly while hauling firewood from the cellar earlier that morning, and none of the senior servants had spared a moment to attend to him. Thessaly knelt beside him immediately. "Let me see that, sweetheart." The boy tried pulling away, embarrassed to be seen crying by the master's daughter. Thessaly took his small wrist with extraordinary care, examining the swelling gently before wrapping it firmly with a clean linen bandage, soaked in cold water and chamomile. "You were very brave carrying all that wood by yourself. Most grown men would have complained far louder than you." A tiny smile broke through the tears on his face. Thessaly reached into her apron pocket and produced a small marzipan sweet she had saved from the dessert preparations. "Our secret. Do not let Cook find out, or we shall both be in terrible trouble." The boy laughed softly and tucked the sweet into his shirt. Moments like these were the only times Thessaly still felt she had a purpose inside the manor, helping people nobody else considered worth helping. Lady Vervain entered the kitchen minutes later, immaculate in dove-gray silk, trimmed with silver thread. Her sharp eyes found Thessaly immediately, crouched on the stone floor beside a servant's child. "There you are. Lady Pemberton has been asking for you. Something about the table arrangements for tomorrow evening." Thessaly stood quickly, brushing flour from her skirt. "I was helping Arlo with his wrist. He was hurt this morning. Lady Vervain glanced briefly at the boy without expression, then returned her attention to Thessaly. Please try not to vanish during gatherings. People already whisper enough about this family, without you giving them further cause. The words were measured and calm, but the disappointment beneath them pressed against Thessaly's chest like a hand pushing her slowly underwater. Lady Vervain never shouted, she never insulted directly. She simply carried a quiet grief about her eldest daughter that had hardened over the years into something that felt worse than anger. It felt like resignation. That evening, Lord Aldrich entertained several prominent landowners inside his private study while discussing potential investments in railway expansion across the northern counties. Thessaly passed the partially open door carrying a tray of clean brandy glasses when her father's voice reached her through the gap. Cosette's marriage strengthened our standing considerably, and Delphia's match brought political connections we had lacked for years. Lord Aldrich spoke with satisfaction, the way a man speaks about successful transactions. "And your eldest?" another gentleman asked carefully. A pause followed that lasted long enough for Thessaly's heartbeat to fill the silence. "Some matters are best left unmentioned," Lord Aldrich replied. Thessaly stopped walking. She stood frozen in the dim corridor, staring down at the brandy glasses trembling on the silver tray in her hands. Then she drew a slow breath, steadied her grip, and continued forward before anyone could discover her listening. Late that night, while autumn rain tapped against the tall windows of the upper floors, preparations began downstairs for Marceline's grand anniversary celebration. Her youngest sister's husband, Lord Pemberton, had insisted on transforming Greybourne Hall into something resembling a royal residence for the occasion. Crates of imported flowers arrived from Holland. Rolls of gold fabric were carried through the entrance hall by servants working in pairs. Musicians gathered in the ballroom to rehearse waltzes that would echo through the estate for 3 consecutive evenings. From the top of the east staircase, Thessaly watched the commotion below in silence. Servants rushed between rooms with excitement on their faces. Her mother supervised arrangements with a vitality Thessaly had not seen from her in months. The entire house was coming alive for someone else's happiness. Again, Greybourne Hall became unrecognizable during the week leading to Marceline's anniversary celebration. Every corridor smelled of fresh roses, melted candle wax, and polished brass. Servants worked from before dawn until well past midnight, carrying enormous glass vases filled with white lilies and trailing ivy through hallways lined with newly hung silk curtains imported from Lyon. The ballroom alone required 3 full days of preparation. Crystal chandeliers were lowered on iron chains so that every individual pendant could be cleaned by hand until the glass caught light from across the room. Long banquet tables were draped in ivory linen and set with gold-rimmed china that had not left the Greybourne vault in over a decade. Clusters of tall beeswax candles were arranged between towering silver candelabras that lined the center of each table like a glowing spine. Lord Aldrich personally approved every detail. The guest list alone filled 4 pages of his ledger, each name selected not for friendship, but for influence. Lady Vervain spent entire mornings debating flower arrangements and seating hierarchies with the head housekeeper, adjusting placements whenever political considerations shifted between invitations. And beneath all of it, holding every thread together without recognition, was Thessaly. She supervised the kitchen staff when disagreements erupted over menu timings. She corrected linen orders that had arrived with the wrong monogram. She calmed a young footman who nearly shattered an entire crate of wine glasses after tripping on a loose carpet edge near the east corridor. She resolved a dispute between 2 florists arguing over whether the ballroom centerpieces should feature open roses or closed buds. She inspected every guest bedroom personally, ensuring fresh towels, heated water, and properly turned down linens waited behind every door. By the morning of the celebration, deep shadows had settled beneath her eyes. Her fingers ached from hours of folding, carrying, and adjusting. Yet not a single member of her family acknowledged the work she had done. Marceline swept through the manor that afternoon as though the entire estate existed solely to frame her entrance. Her anniversary gown had arrived from a dressmaker on Bond Street 2 days earlier. Pale champagne satin layered with hand-stitched lace cascaded from her shoulders to the floor, catching the afternoon light streaming through the ballroom windows. Diamond pins glittered in her dark hair, while a maid followed behind her, adjusting the hem every few steps. Marceline paused beside the west corridor, where Thessaly knelt on the floor, repinning a garland that had come loose from the banister. You missed several candles near the main entrance. They are uneven. Marceline did not slow her pace. If you cannot manage decorations properly, perhaps we should have hired additional staff, rather than relying on someone with no experience running a household of her own. The words landed precisely where they were designed to land. Thessaly adjusted the garland in silence and then walked to the entrance hall to fix the candles. By early evening, carriages lined the long gravel drive leading to Greybourne Hall. Horses stamped impatiently in the cold, while footmen in dark livery helped guests descend onto a carpet of crushed lavender and dried rose petals that stretched from the carriage steps to the front doors. Noble women in embroidered gowns moved through the entrance hall, trailing perfume and soft laughter. Gentlemen in tailored evening coats gathered in clusters near the fireplaces, exchanging political gossip over glasses of imported Burgundy. The ballroom itself drew audible admiration from nearly every guest who entered. Golden light poured downward from the chandeliers in waves, catching crystal glasses, jeweled necklaces, and the polished marble floor that reflected the entire room like a mirror beneath their feet. Platters of roasted venison, glazed carrots, herbed potatoes, smoked trout arranged on beds of watercress, and delicate pastries filled with sweetened cream covered the banquet tables in abundance. Thessaly stood near the musicians, directing servants carrying fresh trays of champagne, when an elderly marchioness approached her with a kind expression. "You must be Lord Aldrich's eldest daughter. What a graceful face you have, my dear. Tell me, when shall we hear news of your own engagement?" The question struck like a blade slipped between ribs. Before Thessaly could form a polite response, a woman standing nearby lowered her voice just enough to be heard. "At her age, the window has rather closed, I am afraid," a third added with practiced sympathy. One must admire her dignity, at least. Thessaly excused herself with a smile that cost her everything to hold in place. The humiliation sharpened further during dinner. Marceline sat beside Lord Pemberton at the head of the long table, basking in toasts from every direction, while guests raised their glasses beneath the warm glow of 100 candles. Lord Pemberton smiled handsomely throughout the evening, though Thessaly noticed his attention wandering repeatedly toward a young woman seated 3 chairs away. Twice. She saw him lean toward the woman during moments when Marceline was distracted by conversation, whispering something that made the woman blush and look away. The observation unsettled Thessaly, but Marceline noticed nothing beyond her own reflection in the admiring faces around her. When the final course arrived, Lady Varaine instructed Thessaly to assist the servants distributing dessert plates, as several members of staff had become overwhelmed by the volume of guests. Thessaly rose without argument and began placing dishes of poached pears, drizzled with honey and crushed pistachios before the seated guests. As she set a plate before Cosette, her eldest younger sister turned toward Delphia with a smirk barely concealed behind her wineglass. "Careful, Thessaly. Continue serving tables this gracefully, and Father may finally find you a position." Below stairs, Delphia covered her mouth with her napkin, shoulders shaking with laughter. Several nearby guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Then Marceline raised her voice from the head of the table, ensuring the entire room could hear. 3 marriages this family has celebrated. 3 daughters who brought honor to the Greybourne name. She paused and let the silence build deliberately before her eyes. drifted toward Thessaly standing motionless beside the dessert trolley. And then there was Thessaly. Laughter erupted across the ballroom. Not malicious laughter from every throat, but enough voices joined willingly that the sound filled the entire room and pressed against Thessaly from every direction. Lady Varaine leaned toward her eldest daughter from across the table, her expression tight with forced composure. "Smile, Thessaly. Do not give anyone reason to believe you cannot endure a simple jest." Thessaly's lips moved into something resembling obedience, but behind her eyes something fractured that no smile could disguise. Lord Aldrich said nothing at all. He simply lifted his wineglass and drank, as though his eldest daughter's humiliation were no more remarkable than the weather. After the final guest departed and the musicians packed her instrument into leather cases, Thessaly climbed the east staircase, alone. The corridor leading to her bedroom stretched long and dark ahead of her while distant sounds of servants clearing plates echoed faintly from below. She closed her bedroom door, pressed her back against it, and slid slowly to the floor. The silence inside the room felt heavier than anything she had carried all evening. Her chest heaved unevenly as tears fell without permission down her face, landing on the dark fabric of her skirt. She pressed both hands over her mouth, not because anyone might hear, but because the sound of her own grief frightened her. A soft knock came. Minutes later, the door opened gently, and Wynne, the maid who had attended Thessaly since childhood, stepped inside, carrying a cup of warm milk mixed with honey and nutmeg. "I thought tonight might be a difficult one," Wynne said, lowering herself to the floor beside Thessaly without hesitation. Thessaly wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I am being ridiculous. No, you are being wounded. And there is nothing ridiculous about it." The kindness in those 5 words broke through every wall Thessaly had built during the evening. She leaned against Wynne's shoulder and cried openly for the first time in months, while the candle on her bedside table flickered low and the rain continued falling against the windows of Greybourne Hall. Somewhere below, in the warmth of the emptying ballroom, Marceline laughed brightly about something trivial. The sound drifted upward through the floors and reached Thessaly's door like a ghost she could not escape. And for the first time in her life, Thessaly allowed herself to think the words she had refused to speak aloud for years. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps I truly am nothing. Long before silence became Thessaly Greybourne's permanent companion, there had once been music inside her. At 23, she moved through the gardens of Greybourne Hall with laughter trailing behind her like perfume carried on summer wind. She played piano in the evenings while the tall drawing-room window stood open, letting warm air and the scent of jasmine drift through the house. She read voraciously. She debated politics with visiting gentlemen who often left the table, visibly surprised by the sharpness of her opinions. She painted watercolors of the lake behind the estate during long afternoons while her sisters played croquet nearby. She had been alive in a way she could no longer remember feeling. That was before Corwin Lennox arrived at Greybourne Hall. Corwin came as assistant to a renowned architect Lord Aldrich had commissioned to redesign the east wing of the manor. Unlike the titled gentleman Thessaly encountered at every dinner and dance, Corwin carried no inherited arrogance. He spoke with precision, listened with genuine attention, and treated every person inside the house with the same respect regardless of their position. The senior servants liked him immediately, which in Thessaly's experience was a far more reliable measure of character than any letter of introduction. Their first real conversation happened by accident. Thessaly had been reading alone in the library one evening when Corwin entered, looking for architectural plans that had been left on the far table. He apologized for the intrusion, but before he could leave, his eyes landed on the book resting open across her lap. "You are reading Wollstonecraft," he said with genuine surprise. Thessaly raised an eyebrow. "Is that remarkable?" "In this house, yes." He smiled with a warmth that made something shift unexpectedly inside her chest. Most drawing rooms I visit keep her safely out of sight. They talked for nearly 2 hours that evening. By the second week, they were exchanging books and debating philosophy beside the garden fountain every afternoon. By the third, Thessaly found herself watching the front drive from her bedroom window each morning, waiting for his arrival without admitting to herself why. Corwin understood parts of her that nobody else had ever attempted to reach. While society measured her value entirely by beauty and marital prospects, he admired her mind, her compassion, and the fierce independence she kept hidden beneath composed manners. He asked her questions nobody had ever asked. What do you actually want from your life, Thessaly? Not what your father wants. Not what society expects. What do you want? Nobody had ever framed her future as something belonging to her before. They spent long afternoons walking beside the lake while fallen leaves drifted across the still water. Sometimes he sketched buildings while she read poetry aloud, and the silence between them felt more comfortable than any conversation she had experienced with anyone else. One evening he played a borrowed violin inside the music room while Thessaly accompanied him on piano, and the melody they created together felt like the first honest thing that had happened inside Greybourne Hall in years. Wynne noticed the change before anyone else. "You have started smiling again," the maid whispered one morning while brushing Thessaly's hair before breakfast. Thessaly blushed deeply but said nothing. Happiness, she had learned, was something best kept quiet inside the Greybourne household. But happiness inside Greybourne Hall had never survived long enough to grow roots. One cold evening in late autumn, Lord Aldrich returned early from a business dinner and discovered Thessaly and Corwin seated together in the library. Corwin had been reading aloud from a volume of Keats, while Thessaly listened with an expression that left nothing to imagination. The tenderness on her face was unmistakable. Lord Aldrich's expression turned to stone. Later that night, his voice carried through the study door with enough force to reach servants standing 2 corridors away. "You entered my home under professional pretense and pursued my daughter knowing you possess neither title, nor land, nor fortune worth mentioning. Do you understand what you have done?" Corwin stood straight, despite the fury directed at him. "I love your daughter sincerely, Lord Greybourne. That is not something I pursued. It is something that happened because she is extraordinary. Love." Lord Aldrich repeated the word as though it tasted of ash. "Love does not protect family legacies. Love does not preserve estates. Love does not prevent society from destroying a name built across 4 generations. Father, please." Thessaly's voice broke as she stepped forward from the doorway. "Please just listen to what he is saying." Lord Aldrich did not look at her. Lady Verain supported the separation with quiet firmness the following morning. She sat beside Thessaly in the drawing room, with her hands folded precisely in her lap. "You must understand, Thessaly. A match beneath our station would make this family the subject of ridicule across every county in the north. I am protecting you from a future filled with regret." "You are protecting yourselves," Thessaly whispered. Lady Verain's expression tightened, but she said nothing more. Corwin was ordered to leave the estate before nightfall. The architect completed his work with a replacement assistant, while Corwin's name was never spoken inside Greybourne Hall again. The next morning, Thessaly found him waiting beside the iron gate at the end of the south garden. Rain fell steadily through the gray sky, while his coat darkened with water, and his leather case rested in the mud beside his boots. His face carried an expression caught between determination and heartbreak. "I will come back for you," he said, while holding her trembling hand so tightly that she could feel his pulse against her fingers. "I will find a way, no matter how long it takes." Thessaly could not speak. She pressed her forehead against his chest and listened to his heartbeat for the last time while rain soaked through both of them. The carriage carried him away through the fog and disappeared beyond the hill. For months she waited for letters. She checked the Morning Post before the servants reached it, terrified that her father might intercept anything bearing Corwin's handwriting. Nothing arrived through the autumn. Nothing arrived through the first weeks of winter. Then in February, a letter finally came, but not from Corwin. A colleague of the architect wrote to Lord Aldrich, informing him that Corwin Lennox had fallen gravely ill with fever during a commission abroad and had died in a boarding house outside Florence. He had been alone. Thessaly remembered the exact moment Wynne placed the letter in her hands. She remembered the way the words blurred as her vision collapsed. She remembered the sound of the teacup slipping from the saucer and shattering across the stone floor at her feet. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 6 days. She refused food. She refused conversation. She refused sunlight. Wynne left trays outside the door 3 times daily and collected them untouched each evening. Something fundamental inside Thessaly did not recover after that winter. The woman who had once laughed beside piano music and debated philosophy with fearless confidence slowly vanished from the halls of Greybourne Hall, replaced by someone quieter, smaller, and more guarded with every part of herself she allowed the world to see. And the family that had destroyed, the only love she ever knew, never once acknowledged what they had taken from her. Cosette Greybourne had married first, and for several glittering years her union with Sir Aldous Merritt appeared to represent everything the Greybourne family valued. Aldous possessed a respected title, a handsome estate in Berkshire, and a reputation among London society as a man of excellent taste and generous hospitality. But behind the doors of their elegant townhouse, the marriage had corroded steadily since the 2nd year. Aldous spent recklessly and stayed out most evenings, returning long after the servants had retired. His charm, so magnetic during courtship, evaporated entirely in private. He treated Cosette with a coldness that bordered on contempt whenever they disagreed, and his spending had become so reckless that Cosette discovered entire rooms of furniture purchased on credit that had never been paid for. Twice she had written to Lord Aldrich requesting financial assistance. Both times her father complied without question, because the alternative was public embarrassment. Cosette never admitted any of this aloud. Instead, she arrived at every gathering wearing new jewelry and fresh confidence like armor polished specifically to blind anyone looking too closely. But servants at the Merritt household whispered. And whispers in aristocratic England always found their way home eventually. Delphia's marriage to Lord Gavin Ashcroft had never contained passion, though that had not been the arrangement's purpose. Gavin possessed political influence, a seat in Parliament, and connections to powerful families whose support Lord Aldrich considered essential for future Greybourne ambitions. What Gavin did not possess was any genuine interest in his wife. He spent most evenings at his parliamentary offices or at private gentlemen's clubs in Westminster, returning to their London residence well past midnight without explanation or apology. Dinners were eaten separately more often than together. Conversations between them had shortened over the years until most exchanges consisted of logistical arrangements delivered with the emotional warmth of business correspondence. Delphia filled the emptiness with social engagements, attending every opera, every luncheon, every exhibition she could find, simply to avoid sitting alone inside a house that felt increasingly like an abandoned museum. Yet she maintained her composure in public with practiced discipline, smiling through gatherings while loneliness pressed steadily against her from the inside, like water slowly filling a sealed room. Marceline's marriage had appeared the most enviable of all. Lord Pemberton was young, handsome, and spectacularly wealthy. He showered her with gifts during their first year together, rubies for her birthday, a racehorse named in her honor, a holiday villa on the southern coast of France that she displayed in conversation like a trophy at every opportunity. But Thessaly had seen what nobody else at the anniversary celebration had been willing to acknowledge. The lingering glances Pemberton directed toward the young woman seated 3 chairs away during dinner. The whispered exchanges. The blush on the woman's face that spoke of something far more intimate than casual acquaintance, within months of the anniversary. Household staff at the Pemberton estate began noticing their master's increasingly frequent absences. He traveled to London for business that never appeared in any ledger. He attended social gatherings without Marceline, and returned with explanations that grew thinner each time. Marceline responded not with confrontation but with spending. Gowns, jewels, redecorations, and lavish entertainments arrived in waves as though beauty and expense could fill the space her husband was steadily vacating. Yet none of the three sisters examined their own marriages honestly. Reflection required courage. They had never been asked to develop. Blame required a target that did not threaten their pride, and Thessaly had always been the easiest target in the family. The cruelty continued through every visit home. During a spring luncheon at Greybourne Hall, Cosette arrived wearing an emerald necklace that Thessaly suspected had been purchased on further credit. She settled into the drawing room beside Delphia and Marceline, while servants brought tea and sandwiches on tiered silver trays. "I saw Lady Whitfield's eldest at the Harrington ball last month," Cosette remarked casually while stirring her tea. "Engaged at 19. 19. Can you imagine?" Delphia shook her head slowly. "Some women simply understand their purpose early." The words were not directed at Thessaly. They did not need to be. The implication landed precisely where it was intended. Marceline set down her teacup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "Honestly, I do wonder sometimes what Thessaly does with all these empty years. No husband to manage, no household to run, no children demanding attention. It must be rather peaceful in a tragic sort of way." Cosette laughed lightly. "Perhaps she has taken up knitting." All three sisters smiled with the particular cruelty of women who had learned to disguise malice as humor so thoroughly that anyone overhearing might mistake it for affection. Thessaly sat in the chair nearest the window, holding a cup of tea she had not tasted, watching rain trail slowly down the glass. She did not respond. She had learned years ago that responding only prolonged the performance. Silence shortened it. Silence allowed them to grow bored and move on to another subject. Silence was not dignity. It was survival. Later that afternoon, while her sisters dressed for an evening concert in the nearby town, Thessaly walked alone through the gardens behind the manor. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and early bluebells. She followed the gravel path toward the lake where she had once walked with Corwin, though she no longer allowed herself to think of him by name during daylight hours. Near the stone bench beside the water, she found old Harland, the estate groundskeeper, struggling to lift a fallen branch from across the garden path. His back had worsened over the winter, and the effort clearly caused him pain. Thessaly reached for the other end of the branch without being asked. Together they dragged it to the side of the path and rested it against the hedge. Harlan nodded gratefully, breathing heavily. "You did not need to do that, Miss Thessaly." "Of course I did." The old man studied her face for a moment with an expression that carried more understanding than anything she had received inside the house all day. "You remind me of your grandmother," he said. "She helped people the same way without announcement, without expecting anything in return." Thessaly smiled, but the ache behind it reached somewhere deeper than she expected. That evening, while the carriage carried her sisters toward the concert, Thessaly remained behind at the estate. She sat in the empty drawing room with a single candle burning beside her, while the house settled into stillness around her. For the first time in years, she opened the small wooden box she kept hidden at the back of her wardrobe. Inside lay a folded letter, a dried sprig of lavender, and a pencil sketch Corwin had drawn of her beside the lake during their last autumn together. She held the sketch with great tenderness, studying the face of a woman she barely recognized anymore. The woman in the drawing was laughing. Thessaly closed the box, returned it to its hiding place, and sat beside the window until the candle burned itself out. The conversation that finally broke something irreparable inside Thessaly happened on a Tuesday evening in late May, when the rest of the household believed she had already retired to bed. She had come downstairs to retrieve a book she had left in the morning room. The corridor was dark except for a thin line of lamplight spilling from beneath her father's study door. Thessaly would have walked past without pausing if she had not heard her own name spoken through the gap. She stopped. Lord Aldrich's voice carried the measured authority he reserved for matters he considered already decided. Aunt Caledonia's property in Shropshire is modest but respectable enough. The grounds are well maintained. The house is furnished adequately. Thessaly would want for nothing in material terms. Lady Varane's reply came after a pause that suggested she had considered these words many times before speaking them aloud. People have begun to talk, Aldrich, not just at gatherings. I received a letter from Lady Hathmore last week, asking whether Thessaly was unwell. She framed it as concern, of course, but the implication was unmistakable. Our eldest daughter's continued presence in this household, without a marriage, without even the prospect of one, has become a source of public speculation that reflects poorly on the entire family. Lord Aldrich exhaled heavily. Cosette raised the same subject with me during her last visit. She feels that Thessaly's situation is beginning to affect the way society perceives the younger marriages. She used the word embarrassment, though I suspect she meant something stronger. A long silence followed. Thessaly pressed her back flat against the corridor wall while her heartbeat filled her ears so loudly that she feared they might hear it through the door. Then Lady Varane spoke again, her voice lower now but no less final. It would be better for everyone, including Thessaly, if we are being fair about it. Living here among constant reminders of what she has not achieved cannot be pleasant for her either. Shropshire would offer her peace, at least. Distance from the scrutiny, a chance to live without comparison. Lord Aldrich cleared his throat. I shall write to Caledonia before the end of the month. The words hung in the dark corridor like smoke that refused to clear. Thessaly did not move. She stood perfectly still against the cold wall, while tears slid down her face and her fingernails pressed so deeply into her palms that she would find small crescent-shaped marks there the following morning. They were sending her away. Not because she had failed at anything within her control, not because she had shamed the family through scandal or poor conduct, simply because her existence, her visible, unmarried, undeniable existence inside Greybourne Hall, had become inconvenient. She was not a daughter to them. She was a problem to be relocated. Thessaly returned to her bedroom without the book. She sat on the edge of her bed in complete darkness, while the house creaked and settled around her. Wynne found her there an hour later, still sitting upright, still fully dressed, staring at the far wall with an expression the maid had never seen before. It was not sadness. Thessaly had carried sadness for years, and Wynne knew every shape it took across her face. This was something emptier, something that had stopped expecting anything at all. "Miss Thessaly," Wynne whispered. "What has happened?" Thessaly looked at her slowly as though returning from somewhere very far away. "They are sending me to Shropshire," she said. Her voice was flat and dry, stripped of everything except the fact itself. "I am to disappear." Wynne lowered herself onto the bed beside Thessaly and took her hand without speaking. There was nothing to say that would not have been a lie. They both knew the decision had already been made. Outside the window, the last light of the spring evening faded beyond the oak trees at the edge of the estate. Somewhere downstairs, Lord Aldrich sealed an envelope addressed to Shropshire and placed it on the silver tray beside the front door for the morning post. And upstairs, in the darkness of her bedroom, Thessaly Greybourne felt the final thread connecting her to her own family pull tight and snap cleanly in two. Across England, the name Everard Blackthorne carried the kind of weight that made powerful men choose their words with care. His estates stretched across 3 counties: forests, farmland, coal mines, and a fleet of merchant vessels operating from the northern ports generated wealth so vast that bankers in London adjusted interest rates when Blackthorne investments shifted direction. Politicians sought his endorsement. Judges respected his family name instinctively. Even noble families whose titles predated his own by centuries treated the Duke of Blackthorn with a deference that bordered on wariness. At 38 years old, Duke Everard Blackthorn had become one of the most influential men in the country. Yet influence had not protected him from becoming one of the most isolated. Blackthorn Manor stood on a cliff overlooking the North Sea, a vast stone fortress surrounded by windswept grounds where ancient yew trees bent permanently toward the land as though trying to escape the constant gale. Inside, dark oak corridors stretched endlessly between high-ceilinged rooms filled with heavy furniture, ancestral portraits, and fireplaces large enough for a man to stand inside. Servants moved through the house in practiced silence, avoiding unnecessary conversation whenever the Duke passed. They had learned over the years that Everard preferred stillness to company and solitude to charm. Most evenings he sat alone inside his private study, reviewing shipping contracts and parliamentary correspondence, while an untouched glass of whiskey gathered warmth beside a dying fire. Invitations to balls, dinners, and royal functions accumulated unopened in stacks across his writing desk. He attended only what political necessity absolutely demanded, and departed the moment obligation allowed. He had not always lived this way. Years earlier, London society had celebrated Everard's courtship of Lady Sabienne Ashford as a story perfectly designed for admiration. Sabienne was not the most beautiful woman in aristocratic circles, nor the wealthiest. What made her extraordinary was something far more disarming. She appeared humble. In a world saturated with ambition disguised as elegance, Sabienne moved through ballrooms with quiet modesty that made her seem refreshingly different. She spoke softly. She listened attentively. She treated servants politely in public. She wore simple gowns among women draped in diamonds and seemed entirely uninterested in the status games that consumed everyone around her. Everard, exhausted by years of women pursuing him with transparent calculation, found Sabienne's apparent gentleness captivating. For the first time, he believed he had found someone who valued substance over spectacle. He confided in her. He trusted her judgment on personal matters he had never shared with anyone. He gifted her family estate badly, needed repairs, and spoke openly about marriage before members of his inner circle. The betrayal, when it came, was surgical. A business associate, uncomfortable with the secret he carried, eventually placed a bundle of private letters into Everard's hands during a meeting at his London club. The letters, written in Sabienne's own hand, revealed a careful and extended correspondence with Lord Radcliffe Vane, a nobleman whose debts had made him desperate for a wealthy patron. The secret relationship had been continuing for over a year, but the letters contained something worse than infidelity. They contained strategy. Sabienne had described Everard to Radcliffe in terms that made the Duke's stomach turn cold. "He is remarkably easy to manage," she had written in one passage. "Men who distrust beauty are helpless against the appearance of sincerity. He believes I am different from the others because I have made simplicity my performance." The word performance burned more deeply than anything else in the letters. Every quiet smile, every modest gown, every gentle word spoken to a servant in his presence, all of it had been calculated. Sabienne had not loved him. She had studied him, identified the precise shape of the armor he wore against the world, and built herself into the exact weapon designed to pass through it. The humiliation afterward spread through London with the speed and cruelty that only aristocratic gossip could achieve. Drawing rooms whispered behind closed fans. Gentlemen exchanged knowing glances at private clubs. Newspapers printed veiled references to a powerful duke deceived by a woman of modest reputation. People did not pity Everard. They found the story amusing. The mighty Blackthorn, brought low by a woman pretending to be ordinary. What destroyed something inside him permanently was not the betrayal itself. It was the realization that he could no longer distinguish between genuine kindness and performance. If Sabian could construct humility so convincingly that he, a man who prided himself on reading people, had been completely fooled, then how could he ever trust quiet virtue again? After that winter, Everard withdrew from society almost entirely. Women continued pursuing him relentlessly. Ambitious mothers positioned daughters in his path at every unavoidable gathering. Young noblewomen laughed too eagerly at his remarks and complimented his estates with practiced breathlessness. But the bolder their efforts, the more easily he dismissed them. Their transparency made them safe. He could see through obvious ambition without difficulty. It was the unassuming ones who frightened him now. The women who stood at the edges of ballrooms, the ones who spoke softly and appeared gentle. The ones who reminded him of Sabian, those were the women Everard kept at the greatest distance, because they represented the only threat that had ever breached his defenses. And that single wound explained everything about the night. He glanced across a crowded ballroom and dismissed Thessaly Greyborn without a second thought. Nobody important. The words had not been cruel by intention. They had been reflexive. A woman standing alone at the edge of a room, wearing a modest gown among brighter colors, drawing no attention to herself. She matched the pattern that Everard's damaged instincts had learned to reject automatically. He did not see her. He saw the ghost of someone who had once fooled him completely. One gray afternoon, Dowager Duchess Lenora Blackthorne entered her son's study, carrying a tray of roast beef sandwiches, warm broth, and black tea, after learning from the kitchen staff that he had not eaten since the previous evening. "You cannot continue living as though the walls of this house are all that exist," she said firmly, while setting the tray beside his untouched correspondence. Everard continued reading a shipping report without looking up. "I am not hiding, Mother. I am working. You have attended 2 social occasions in 18 months, Everard. 2. Even your father, who despised ballrooms, managed more than that. Father also died miserable and alone in this very room." The words landed harder than he intended. Lenora studied her son's face. The sharpness that had once made him commanding had hardened over the years into something that resembled permanent exhaustion. Lines had settled around his eyes that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with a man who slept poorly and trusted no one. "She deceived you," Lenora said softly. "But deception is not the permanent condition of every woman alive." Everard finally turned toward the rain-streaked windows. "The convincing ones are worse than the obvious ones," he replied flatly. "At least ambition announces itself. Kindness can be manufactured for years before the truth surfaces." Lenora sighed deeply. More than anything, she feared her son would spend the remainder of his life sealed inside this fortress, surrounded by wealth and suspicion, growing colder with every passing year until nothing remained inside him capable of warmth. 3 days later, a formal summons arrived from the royal household, requesting Duke Blackthorne's presence at the Queen's annual ball at Hartfield Palace. Unlike ordinary invitations, a royal summons permitted no refusal. Attendance was expected. Absence required explanation directly to the crown. Everard stared at the heavy cream envelope sealed with the royal crest. "You intend to go?" Lenora asked from across the breakfast table. "I intend to survive the evening," Everard replied without expression. Nothing beyond that. The night of the ball arrived beneath heavy clouds and the first cold winds of early autumn. Servants fastened Everard's dark coat, while horses stamped restlessly outside the manor entrance. Inside the carriage, silence surrounded him completely, except for the steady rhythm of wheels turning against wet gravel. As the journey continued through darkening countryside, distant lights from Hartfield Palace slowly emerged through the mist ahead, glowing against the horizon like a second sunset. Everard leaned back against the carriage seat and closed his eyes. He expected nothing from the evening except obligation. Another ballroom filled with people performing admiration while calculating advantage. Another collection of faces he would forget before the carriage carried him home. He had no way of knowing that this particular evening would dismantle every certainty he had built around himself. Hartfield Palace blazed with light visible from nearly a mile away. Hundreds of lanterns lined the long gravel approach, their flames flickering inside glass casings that cast golden patterns across the carriages rolling steadily toward the entrance. The palace itself rose in pale limestone behind manicured gardens, its tall windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky, while orchestral music drifted outward through open doors. Inside, the grand ballroom surpassed anything even the wealthiest private estates could replicate. The ceiling soared 3 stories above the floor, painted with scenes of mythological triumph, in shades of blue, gold, and rose. Enormous chandeliers hung from gilded chains, each holding over 200 candles that filled the room with a light so rich it made every surface shimmer. Mirrors lined the walls between marble columns wrapped in trailing white roses, doubling the spectacle into infinity. Long banquet tables stretched the full length of the eastern wall, draped in white linen and burdened with silver platters of roasted pheasant, glazed with black-currant fillets of smoked salmon on beds of dill and crushed ice, towers of sugared fruits glistening beneath the light, warm bread rolls with salted butter, and crystal bowls of champagne sorbet. The scent of roasted meat, fresh flowers, melted wax, and expensive perfume merged into something overwhelming. Every significant family in England had answered the Queen's invitation. Earls, viscounts, baronesses, and members of Parliament moved through the crowd in tailored evening wear and embroidered gowns. Diamonds caught the light from every direction. Lord Aldrich Greybourne had secured invitations for the family through a political connection he had cultivated for precisely this purpose. He arrived with Lady Varaine on his arm, followed by Cosette, Delphia, and Marceline, each dressed in gowns selected to attract maximum attention. Cosette wore deep sapphire silk. Delphia chose pale gold satin. Marceline wore crimson velvet trimmed with diamonds at her throat. Thessaly walked several paces behind them in a gown of soft dove gray. Lady Varaine had selected it personally, choosing a color that would not compete with her younger daughters. The fabric was fine but plain. The only adornment was a thin silver chain around her neck that had belonged to her grandmother. Thessaly felt the familiar sensation of invisibility settle across her shoulders the moment she entered the ballroom. Surrounded by women whose beauty, confidence, and jewelry announced their value from across the room, old insecurities returned with suffocating force. Her sisters noticed her discomfort immediately and exchanged satisfied looks. "She appears rather lost," Cosette murmured behind her fan. "Perhaps she will find a corner and remain there for the evening," Delphia replied. "It would be better for everyone." Duke Everard Blackthorne arrived 20 minutes after the Greybournes. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Women straightened instinctively. Ambitious mothers gripped their daughters' arms with sudden urgency, while whispering instructions through tight smiles. Everard moved through the crowd with the practiced detachment of a man who had learned to endure admiration without absorbing it. A young countess complimented his estates and received a nod so short it barely qualified as acknowledgement. Then someone nearby whispered a question while gesturing toward the edge of the ballroom, where Thessaly stood alone, holding a glass of champagne she had not touched. And the Duke's answer carried clearly enough for at least a dozen people to hear, including Thessaly herself. Her? Nobody important. The word struck with a precision that years of family cruelty had not dulled her against. Hearing dismissal from her own sisters was a wound she had learned to bandage through repetition. Hearing it from a stranger, spoken with such casual indifference that he had not even looked in her direction, reached somewhere different entirely. It confirmed what she had feared most deeply: that her invisibility was not a family affliction, but a permanent condition visible to the entire world. She turned away and moved toward the far wall, pressing herself into the narrow space between a marble column and a cascading arrangement of white roses, trying to breathe without drawing attention. And then the grand doors opened. The royal herald's staff struck the marble floor with 3 resonant blows that silenced the orchestra mid-phrase her. "Majesty, Queen Margot." The ballroom lowered collectively. Every head bowed. Every conversation ceased. The queen entered in a gown of ivory silk, layered with delicate pearl embroidery that shimmered with each measured step. A simple diamond tiara rested in her silver-streaked hair, and her expression carried the calm authority of a woman who had ruled through decades of political turbulence without once raising her voice. Queen Margot moved through the parting crowd slowly, acknowledging familiar faces with small nods. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see where her attention would land. She passed Lord Aldrich with a polite inclination of her head. She passed Cosette, Delphia, and Marceline without pausing. She walked directly past Duke Everard Blackthorne, who bowed correctly, but received only the briefest glance. Then the queen stopped. She turned toward the marble column near the eastern wall where Thessaly stood frozen, barely breathing, her gray gown nearly lost among the white roses behind her. And in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom, Queen Margot spoke. "Thessaly Greyborn, I have been hoping to meet you in person for some time." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of candle wax dripping onto crystal could be heard from across the room. Thessaly's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her mind emptied entirely as the most powerful woman in England stood before her, smiling warmly, while every pair of eyes in the ballroom fixed upon her. "Your Majesty," Thessaly finally managed, her curtsy trembling visibly. "I do not understand." Queen Margot's smile deepened. "I am told you have spent 3 years visiting the Children's Hospital at Whitmore Cross every week without fail. I am told you read to the patients, bring medicines purchased from your own allowance, and sit beside children whom even their own families have stopped visiting. I am told that when the hospital nearly lost its funding last winter, an anonymous benefactor arranged a solution through a solicitor in the village. My advisors eventually traced that arrangement back to you." Thessaly felt heat rush painfully across her face. She had never spoken of the hospital visits to anyone inside Greyborn Hall. They were hers alone. The one part of her life where she felt she mattered. The queen continued, her voice carrying effortlessly across the marble. "I have spent 40 years surrounded by people who perform charity for applause. You performed yours in silence, expecting nothing in return. That is the rarest quality I have encountered in all my years." Upon this throne, Thessaly's eyes burned as tears pressed dangerously forward. Across the ballroom, Cosette's face had drained of color. Delphia gripped her fan so tightly, the ivory handle cracked faintly in her palm. Marceline stared at her eldest sister as though seeing a stranger. Lord Aldrich's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. Lady Verraine pressed one gloved hand against her stomach, as though absorbing a physical blow. And Duke Everard Blackthorne stood motionless among the crowd, staring at the woman he had dismissed minutes earlier, while something sharp and unfamiliar twisted behind his ribs. The queen extended her hand. "Come, sit beside me this evening. I should like to hear more about the work you have been doing." Thessaly placed her trembling fingers into the queen's hand and was led through the parting crowd toward the royal table. Every guest she passed stared openly. As she walked, a loud crash interrupted the moment. A young servant girl carrying champagne had stumbled near one of the side tables. Crystals shattered across the floor while pale liquid spread over the marble. The girl froze in visible terror as nearby guests stepped backward with sharp expressions of annoyance. Before anyone else moved, Thessaly released the queen's hand, knelt beside the trembling girl, and spoke to her with steady gentleness. "It is all right. Let me see your hand. You are bleeding." She removed a handkerchief from her sleeve and wrapped the servant's cut fingers with the same unhurried care she had shown Arlo months earlier, ignoring the wine soaking through the hem of her dove-gray gown. The queen watched the entire scene without moving, Then she smiled in a way that suggested Thessaly had just confirmed something she had already believed. From across the ballroom, Everard observed the moment without blinking. Something twisted unexpectedly inside his chest. Thessaly returned to the Queen's side and was seated at the royal table. As she passed the column where Everard stood, their eyes met for the first time. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight, and his gaze did not leave her face. Thessaly looked away first. She had no reason to hold the attention of a man who had called her nobody important. But Everard continued watching her for the remainder of the evening. He watched her speak with the Queen, her posture gradually relaxing as genuine conversation replaced the terror of the initial moment. He watched her thank a servant who refilled her water glass, addressing the young woman by name after reading it from the small pin on her uniform. He watched her step away from the royal table to help an elderly marchioness whose walking cane had slipped, retrieving it without fuss and ensuring the woman was comfortable before returning to her seat. He watched her do all of this, without performance, without awareness of being observed, without any of the staging he had spent years training himself to detect. And somewhere deep inside the fortress he had constructed around himself, a crack appeared that he could not explain and did not know how to seal. After supper, as the orchestra resumed and couples began moving across the dance floor, Everard found himself standing before the royal table, without entirely remembering the decision to walk there. Thessaly looked up at him with an expression caught between surprise and guarded distance. "Miss Greybourne," he said, and the steadiness of his own voice surprised him. "I owe you an apology. I spoke carelessly earlier this evening, and I am ashamed of the words I used." Thessaly studied his face. The ballroom continued moving around them, but neither seemed aware of it. "You called me nobody important," she replied. "I have heard worse from people who share my own blood. You need not trouble yourself, Your Grace." The calm honesty unsettled him more than anger would have. "Would you honor me with a dance?" he asked. Thessaly hesitated. Then she glanced toward the Queen, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, accompanied by the faintest trace of a smile. Thessaly placed her hand in his. As the orchestra played a slow waltz, Everard guided her across the polished floor beneath the enormous chandeliers. She moved with more grace than he expected, though tension lingered visibly in her shoulders.
"You seem uncomfortable,"
he said. "I am unaccustomed to being visible," she answered simply. The honesty in those words reached past every defense he carried. Unlike every woman who had spoken to him that evening, Thessaly did not mention his wealth, his title, his estates, or his influence. She spoke about the hospital, about a boy named Arlo who worked too hard for his age, about a groundskeeper whose kindness had meant more to her than any compliment she had received in years. She spoke about ordinary things with extraordinary warmth, and Everard felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. He believed her. Around them, whispers erupted through the ballroom like fire catching across dry grass. The Queen singled her out personally. Now Blackthorn is dancing with her. Did you see the sisters' faces? Who is this woman? By the time the waltz ended, Thessaly curtsied and returned to the edge of the room, disappearing once again into the space between the column and the roses, as though the entire evening had been a dream she expected to wake from at any moment. But Everard remained standing on the dance floor after she left, watching the space where she had been, feeling the crack inside him widen into something he could no longer ignore. After the Queen's ball at Hartfield Palace, Duke Everard Blackthorn began appearing at Greybourne Hall with a frequency that made the household staff exchange knowing glances behind closed doors. His carriage arrived so regularly that the head cook started preparing his preferred tea, strong black with a single slice of lemon, the moment wheels were heard on the gravel drive. At first, London society treated the visits as an extraordinary curiosity. The Duke of Blackthorn, who had refused every social invitation for years, was suddenly spending his afternoons at a country estate visiting a woman the entire aristocracy had dismissed as unmarriageable. Newspapers began printing observations about the mysterious attention the Duke appeared to be giving Lord Aldrich Greybourne's eldest daughter. Gossip moved through drawing rooms, opera halls, and Sunday church gatherings with the speed and persistence of a winter virus. Surely he feels pity. No serious man visits a woman of her age without ulterior motive. Perhaps it is a business arrangement with the father. The Queen's endorsement must have created some kind of obligation. Inside Greybourne Hall, the transformation was immediate and shameless. Lord Aldrich, who had been preparing to exile Thessaly to Shropshire only weeks earlier, now insisted she sit beside him during every meal. He asked her opinion on household matters, in front of visiting guests, and introduced her to potential business associates with a warmth that would have been unrecognizable months ago. The letter to Aunt Caledonia was never mentioned again. Lady Varane's behavior changed even more dramatically. Expensive gowns began arriving from London dressmakers twice a week. Midnight blue velvet, pale rose silk, cream satin embroidered with delicate silver thread. Thessaly's wardrobe, which had consisted almost entirely of gray and dark blue for years, suddenly overflowed with color. Lady Varane appeared in Thessaly's bedroom every morning before breakfast, adjusting necklaces, suggesting hairstyles, and offering advice that carried the desperate energy of someone trying to build a bridge across a gap she had spent a decade widening. "The Duke values elegance," Lady Varane insisted one afternoon while fastening a strand of pearls around Thessaly's throat. "First impressions have long since passed, but lasting impressions require constant effort." Thessaly barely recognized the sudden affection. Part of her wanted to believe it was genuine. A larger part understood that her value inside this household had always been conditional, and the condition had simply changed from invisible burden to potential asset. Her sisters understood this immediately, and they despised it. Cosette arrived at Greybourne Hall for an unscheduled visit, 3 weeks after the Queen's ball, her face tight with barely concealed fury. She sat in the drawing room beside Delphia and Marceline while servants brought tea and lemon cakes on silver trays. The conversation began before the door fully closed. She manipulated the entire evening, Cosette said flatly, stirring her tea with sharp, rapid strokes. Nobody suddenly receives royal attention without engineering it. She must have arranged the hospital visits specifically to reach the Queen's circle. Delphia nodded slowly. She has always been cleverer than she appears. The quiet ones always are. She makes herself look humble, and men fall over themselves to rescue her. It is a strategy, not a personality. Marceline's response carried the most venom. She has spent years making us look heartless by comparison. Every time she helped a servant or visited some miserable hospital, she was building a case against us. And now the Duke walks into our house every week, and father treats her like the firstborn son he never had. The bitterness between them thickened with every visit Everard made. Cosette began writing letters to acquaintances across London, planting subtle suggestions that Thessaly had deliberately cultivated the Queen's attention through calculated charity. The whisper campaign spread with disturbing efficiency. Within weeks, certain drawing rooms were openly questioning whether Thessaly Greybourne's goodness was genuine, or merely the most sophisticated manipulation English society had ever witnessed. Delphia went further. During a dinner gathering at her London townhouse, she arranged for Lady Sabienne Ashford to attend as a guest, knowing precisely what Sabienne's presence would trigger. Sabienne arrived wearing black silk and pearls, her composure immaculate, and her beauty maintained despite the scandal that had isolated her from Everard's circle years earlier. She moved through the evening with confidence, positioning herself near Everard at every opportunity. "You look well," Everard, Sabienne remarked, during a pause in conversation, her voice soft enough to sound intimate to anyone watching from across the room. "I hear you have found yourself a new project." The word project was chosen precisely. It reduced Thessaly to something temporary, something charitable, something that would pass. Everard's expression remained controlled, but his eyes hardened. Miss Greybourne is not a project. Of course not, Sabian replied with a smile that suggested she believed the opposite entirely. Though one does wonder what a woman like her could possibly offer a man like you. She is sweet enough, I suppose. But sweetness without substance grows tiresome rather quickly, does it not? The deliberate echo of her own past performance was not lost on Everard. Sabienne was reminding him that she too had once appeared sweet. That gentleness could be a mask, that he had been fooled before and would be fooled again. For a fraction of a moment, doubt crossed Everard's face. Sabienne saw it, and her smile widened, almost imperceptibly. Across the room, Thessaly stood near the window, watching the exchange without hearing the words. She saw Sabienne lean closer. She saw Everard's expression shift. She saw something that looked from a distance like a connection between two people who shared a history she would never fully understand, and something painful tightened inside her chest. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Thessaly sat alone inside the Greybourne drawing room, staring into the dying fire. Wynne entered, carrying a shawl, and draped it around Thessaly's shoulders. "You are thinking too loudly, Miss Thessaly. I can hear it from the corridor." Thessaly smiled faintly, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps they are right, Wynne. Perhaps a man like the Duke cannot truly be interested in someone like me. Perhaps he simply feels guilt about what he said at the ball, and this is merely an extended apology." Wynne knelt beside her chair and looked directly into her face. "I have watched that man sit in this house for 3 hours at a time, listening to you talk about hospital children and garden flowers and books he has probably never read. No man alive apologizes for that long, Miss Thessaly. Whatever he feels, guilt is not the whole of it." Thessaly wanted to believe her, but years of being told she was worth nothing had built walls inside her that even Wynne's kindness could not fully penetrate. And the sisters continued sharpening their weapons in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to drive the blade home. The moment that changed everything arrived on an evening Thessaly was not meant to witness. Everard had returned to Greybourne Hall after supper to retrieve a folio of documents he had left in Lord Aldrich's study during an earlier visit. The household believed he had already departed for the evening. Servants had begun extinguishing candles in the main corridors, and the family had retreated to the drawing room for their customary late wine. As Everard walked through the dim corridor toward the study, voices carried through the partially open drawing room door. He recognized each one immediately. Cosette spoke first, her tone acidic beneath a veneer of casual observation. "Honestly, the entire situation has become unbearable. Every conversation in London now revolves around Thessaly and her miraculous charity work, as though none of us have ever contributed to anything worthwhile." Delphia added in a low voice. She has always known how to make herself appear saintly by making everyone around her look cruel. It is her greatest talent. Marceline's voice cut through with a sharpness that made Everard stop walking entirely. "The truth is, she is desperate. A woman of 32 with no prospects and no offers would cling to any powerful man who showed her a moment of attention. The Duke is simply too polite to recognize desperation when it wears a modest gown and a sad expression." Laughter followed, not loud, but confident. The laughter of women who believed themselves completely safe from consequence. Then Lady Verane's voice, lower than the others, but no less damaging. "I simply hope she does not embarrass the family further. If the Duke's interest fades, and it almost certainly will, the attention from the Queen will dissipate alongside it, and we shall be left with exactly what we had before, an unmarried eldest daughter and an entire society wondering what went wrong." Lord Aldrich said nothing. His silence confirmed everything. Everard pushed the drawing-room door open. The room fell instantly silent. Cosette's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Delphia's face went white. Marceline stared at the Duke with the wide eyes of someone who had never once faced a consequence for cruelty. Lady Vervain pressed herself back into her chair, as though trying to disappear into the upholstery. Lord Aldrich rose slowly from his seat, but no words came. Everard stood in the doorway before speaking. When his voice came, it was controlled, measured, and devastating in its quietness. I have spent years surrounded by people who disguise selfishness as sophistication. I believed I had seen every form of cruelty that existed within polite society. He paused, allowing the silence to press against every person in the room, but I had never witnessed a family dismantle one of its own members so thoroughly and so cheerfully as I have watched you do to Thessaly. Nobody moved. She has endured your mockery without retaliation. She has managed your households, organized your celebrations, and comforted your servants while receiving nothing in return except contempt. She has spent years performing kindness for strangers because her own family offered her none. And the Queen of England recognized what you refused to see, because it was inconvenient for your vanity. Everard's gaze moved slowly across each face in the room. Thessaly Greybourne possesses more integrity, more courage, and more genuine worth than everyone seated in this room combined, and the fact that none of you ever recognized it is not her failure. It is yours. Then he turned and walked from the room before anyone could summon a response. He found Thessaly outside. She stood alone in the garden beneath the old oak tree near the lake, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. Moonlight fell through the branches and scattered silver patterns across the dark water behind her. When she turned toward him, her eyes were already wet. She had heard everything. The corridor between the drawing room and the garden doors carried sound further than anyone inside had realized. Thessaly tried to speak, but the words collapsed before they reached her lips. She covered her mouth with trembling fingers and looked away, embarrassed by the force of her own emotion. "No one has ever said those things about me," she whispered finally. "Not once. Not ever." Something inside Everard shifted with a force that surprised him. Standing before him was a woman who had been told she was worthless for so long that a single act of defense had broken through years of composure. He stepped closer. Not close enough to overwhelm her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence. "Then they should have," he said. Thessaly looked up at him, and neither of them spoke. The moonlight caught the silver chain at her throat and the tears still clinging to her eyelashes, and Everard understood with absolute certainty that what he felt standing in this garden was something no amount of suspicion or self-protection could explain away. That night, long after his carriage had departed Greybourne Hall and the roads had darkened completely, Everard sat alone inside the moving carriage beneath the glow of a small lantern. In his coat pocket, wrapped inside a square of dark velvet, rested a ring he had commissioned from a jeweler in London 4 days earlier. He had not told anyone about it. He had not been certain himself until this evening. Now he was. The Queen's midsummer reception at Hartfield Palace was the most prestigious invitation of the social calendar, reserved exclusively for families and individuals. Her Majesty wished to honor personally. Attendance could not be requested, purchased, or arranged through political influence. Every name on the guest list was selected by the Queen herself. When the Greybourne family received their invitation, Lord Aldrich's hands trembled visibly while breaking the royal seal. Lady Vervain read the enclosed letter 3 times before setting it down on the breakfast table. The invitation bore Thessaly's name specifically, with a handwritten note from the Queen's private secretary, requesting that Miss Greybourne be seated near the royal table during the evening reception. The estate erupted into preparation, unlike anything Greybourne Hall had witnessed before. Dressmakers arrived from London within 2 days. Lord Aldrich commissioned a new carriage for the journey. Lady Vervain personally supervised every detail of Thessaly's appearance with an intensity that bordered on obsession, selecting a gown of deep ivory silk embroidered with pale gold thread and small freshwater pearls sewn along the neckline and sleeves. It was the most beautiful garment Thessaly had ever worn, Cosette, Delphia, and Marceline were included in the invitation as members of the Greyborn family, though none of their names appeared individually. The distinction was not lost on them. For the first time in their lives, they were attending a gathering as additions to Thessaly rather than the reverse. The three sisters dressed in silence that evening. No laughter echoed between their rooms, no teasing remarks carried through the corridors. The atmosphere inside Greyborn Hall had shifted permanently since the night Everard confronted them in the drawing room, and though none of the sisters had spoken about it directly, the weight of his words had settled across the household like a weather pattern that refused to move on. Hartfield Palace on Midsummer Evening surpassed even the splendor of the autumn ball. The gardens had been transformed into an outdoor reception space illuminated by thousands of glass lanterns hanging from iron frames woven between ancient lime trees. Paths of crushed white stone wound between rose beds in full bloom, leading toward a central courtyard where long tables draped in pale linen held silver platters of chilled lobster, herb-crusted lamb carved at the table, roasted figs wrapped in prosciutto, towers of summer berries with clotted cream, elderflower syllabubs served in crystal glasses, and baskets of warm bread with churned butter and sea salt. Musicians played from a raised stone platform surrounded by trailing wisteria, their strings carrying across the warm evening air. Thessaly arrived with her family and immediately felt the atmosphere shift around her. Guests who had ignored her for years now offered warm greetings. Women who had once whispered pity behind their fans now smiled with what appeared to be genuine respect. The Queen's endorsement had not merely changed Thessaly's social position. It had revealed how eagerly society would follow whatever direction power pointed. The observation did not make Thessaly bitter. It made her sad. Duke Everard Blackthorn arrived shortly after the Greyborns. He wore a dark evening coat that emphasized the severity of his features. But when his eyes found Thessaly across the courtyard, standing beneath a canopy of white roses with lantern light falling against the ivory silk of her gown, something behind his composure shifted visibly enough that nearby guests noticed. After supper, as the orchestra transitioned from dining music to waltzes and the garden lanterns brightened against the deepening sky, Everard moved through the crowd with purpose. Thessaly saw him approaching but did not understand the expression on his face. It was not the polite composure she had grown accustomed to during his visits. It was something more open, more vulnerable, more frightened than she had ever seen from a man who seemed afraid of nothing. He stopped before her in the center of the courtyard. Guests nearby sensed the shift in atmosphere, and conversation softened into silence. The orchestra allowed the current piece to fade until only the sound of evening birdsong and distant fountain water remained. Everard reached into his coat and withdrew a small box covered in dark velvet. The silence spread outward from the courtyard like a wave, rippling through the garden paths until nearly every guest at Hartfield Palace had turned toward the same point. Thessaly's breath stopped. "Miss Thessaly Greyborn," Everard said. His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of emotion that anyone paying attention could hear. "I spent years believing that genuine kindness did not exist. I built walls against every person who approached me, because I was certain that warmth was nothing more than a weapon disguised as affection." He paused. The courtyard was so silent that the flame inside the nearest lantern could be heard flickering against its glass casing. "Then I watched you kneel beside a frightened servant girl and bandage her bleeding hand while wine soaked through your gown. You told me about a boy named Arlo, and the way you spoke his name told me more about your heart than any grand gesture ever could. I learned you had spent years sitting beside gravely ill children in a hospital nobody important ever visited, and you did all of it without any expectation that a single person would notice." Thessaly's eyes had already filled with tears that she no longer attempted to control. They spilled freely down her cheeks while her hands pressed against her mouth. "I called you nobody important," Everard continued, and the regret in his voice reached every corner of the silent garden. Those words will follow me for the rest of my life, because the truth is the opposite. You are the most important person I have ever known, not because of beauty or title or wealth or influence, but because you possess a heart that remained kind after years of cruelty that would have turned most people bitter beyond repair. He opened the velvet box slowly. Inside rested a single oval sapphire, the color of a winter sky, just before snowfall, surrounded by small diamonds set in white gold. It was beautiful in the way that genuine things are beautiful, and the choice spoke louder than any display of wealth ever could. Everard lowered himself to one knee on the crushed white stone of the courtyard. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" A sound escaped Thessaly that she could not control. It was not a word. It was the sound of a decade of silence, loneliness, grief, and endurance breaking apart inside her chest all at once. Her shoulders shook. Her hands shook uncontrollably against her face. Years of being told she was worthless. Years of carrying the memory of a love destroyed by her own family. Years of serving and helping and giving without ever receiving recognition or warmth in return. All of it crashed through her in a single overwhelming wave. Then she nodded through the tears. And then the word came, barely a whisper but enough to carry across the silent courtyard. Yes, the applause that erupted across the garden was immediate and thunderous. Women pressed handkerchiefs against their eyes. Even gentlemen who prided themselves on emotional restraint looked away briefly to compose themselves. And then, from the royal table near the center of the courtyard, Queen Margot rose from her chair. The applause softened as every guest recognized the significance of the moment. The Queen walked toward Thessaly and Everard. She stopped before them with an expression that carried warmth, satisfaction, and something resembling vindication. "I spoke your name once before, Thessaly," the Queen said, her voice carrying across the garden with effortless authority. "I spoke it because I believed England deserved to know it. Tonight, I speak it again." She paused and looked directly into Thessaly's tear-streaked face. Thessaly Greybourne, the future Duchess of Blackthorn. "And the finest heart in my kingdom!" The second wave of applause shook the lanterns in the trees above them. Cosette stood frozen at the edge of the courtyard. Delphia lowered her eyes to the ground and kept them there. Marcellin turned away from the scene entirely, pressing a gloved hand against her mouth, though whether from emotion or humiliation, no one standing near her could tell. Lord Aldrich stared at his eldest daughter, as though seeing her clearly for the first time in his life. And Lady Vervain, standing beside him with one hand gripping his arm for support, carried an expression heavier and more painful than anything Thessaly had ever seen on her mother's face. It was not shock. It was not pride. It was the unmistakable weight of a woman, realizing too late exactly what she had spent 15 years failing to protect. Years passed after that evening in the gardens of Hartfield Palace. Say, as Duchess of Blackthorn, Thessaly became one of the most admired women in England, not because of her title or the vast wealth her marriage had brought her, but because of the way she carried both. She expanded the Whitmore Cross Hospital and established 3 new charitable institutions across the northern counties. She visited every one personally. She remembered patients by name. She insisted that every person who entered her care be treated with the same dignity, regardless of birth. Everard, standing beside her through every season, slowly became a different man. The coldness that had defined him thawed gradually under the steady warmth of a woman who asked nothing of him except honesty. He smiled more frequently. He laughed in ways that his own mother wept to witness, because she had spent years believing that sound had been lost permanently. Meanwhile, the perfect marriages that had once cast Thessaly in such unflattering shadow collapsed under the weight of their own hollowness. Sir Aldous Merritt's debts finally exceeded what Lord Aldrich could conceal. Cosette was forced to close their London townhouse and retreat to a modest country property, while creditors pursued her husband through the courts. Lord Gavin Ashcroft's political career ended abruptly after a scandal involving misappropriated parliamentary funds. Delphia found herself isolated inside a marriage that had never offered companionship even before disgrace arrived. Lord Pemberton's infidelities became public knowledge after a former companion sold private letters to a London newspaper. Marceline, who had built her entire identity around the appearance of an enviable marriage, watched that identity disintegrate across society pages she could not prevent anyone from reading. One winter afternoon, 3 familiar carriages arrived at the gates of Blackthorn Manor. Thessaly watched from the upstairs window as her sisters descended onto the gravel drive. Their gowns were older now. Their faces carried exhaustion where confidence had once lived. She met them inside the drawing room beside a fire Wynne had built that morning. Snow fell steadily beyond the tall windows, while the scent of warm bread and cinnamon drifted from the kitchens below. None of her sisters could hold her gaze easily. Cosette looked at the floor. Delphia studied her own hands, folded tightly in her lap. Marceline sat furthest from Thessaly, her lips pressed together in a line that trembled faintly at the edges. Thessaly did not ask them to explain why they had come. She did not ask for apologies. She did not remind them of a single word they had spoken against her over 15 years of cruelty. She poured them tea, she offered them warmth, she asked about their children. And the kindness in her voice, steady and genuine and entirely without condition, was more devastating than any act of revenge could ever have been. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never punishment. It was becoming loved for the very qualities they had once called worthless. It was proving, not through argument, but through the patient accumulation of a life lived with integrity, that real worth was never measured by beauty, youth, marriage, or the opinions of people too frightened to look beyond the surface. And England learned what the Greyborn family discovered far too late, that the woman they dismissed as nobody important had been the most important person in the room all along.